My daughter called at 3 in the morning, "Dad, help me," and then the line went dead. When I arrived, her mother-in-law sneered, "She's not going anywhere." So I backed up my truck and smashed through their $20,000 gate. The alarm sirens wailed through the night. I didn't care. My F-150 truck roared. The smell of burning rubber filled the air. My mud-stained leather boots slammed down on the gas pedal. Ahead of me stood the lavish Harrington estate. It had been built with the blood and sweat of working people like me. But inside that mansion, my daughter was in danger. Welcome back to Dad's real-life revenge. Grab a drink, some snacks, get comfortable, and remember the people in these stories had every opportunity to do the right thing, they simply chose not to. Leave a comment with the number 1 so we can continue the story, and hit subscribe. You're going to enjoy this one. My daughter's mother-in-law, Margaret Harrington, stepped out onto the balcony. She was wearing an expensive silk dress. A glass of red wine rested in her hand. She looked down at me with contempt in her eyes. She saw me as something beneath her. She said my daughter was mentally unstable. She said Sarah was asleep and that no one was allowed to disturb her. She ordered the security guards to throw me out. I didn't argue. I shifted into reverse. The truck backed up 10 meters. I looked her straight in the eye. The calmness of a man who had spent 30 years battling the roads kept me from feeling any fear. I floored the accelerator. The truck surged forward like an iron beast. A thunderous crash split the quiet night in two. The $20,000 decorative iron gate collapsed. My truck's grille crumpled. The windshield cracked. But the path was open. I opened the door and stepped out. I walked forward with steady strides. The security guards backed away in fear. They saw a silent man with hands covered in calluses. My silence was more frightening than any threat. I shoved aside the butler who tried to block my way. I headed straight to the second floor. A father's instincts guided me. I kicked open the master bathroom door. What I saw inside made my heart tighten. Sarah was lying on the cold marble floor. My daughter was trembling. Her face was pale. Her eyes were dull and lifeless. Beside her was an empty syringe. They had drugged my child. They had turned a brilliant young woman into someone who knew nothing. I lifted Sarah into my arms. She felt weightless. A cold rage rose inside my chest. The Harringtons were wealthy. The Harringtons were powerful, but they had made a fatal mistake. They had laid a hand on Frank Miller's daughter. Her mother-in-law stood in the doorway. She screamed that I was going to prison. I looked at her. I didn't say a word. I simply carried Sarah past her. The smell of her expensive perfume could not hide the rot inside. This war had only just begun. They had money. I had my own sense of justice. The sound of police sirens echoed from the distance. Red and blue lights flashed through the large windows of the Harrington estate. I didn't run. I laid Sarah across the back seat of my F-150. My daughter was still unconscious. Her breathing was weak. 4 patrol cars boxed my truck in. 10 gun barrels were pointed directly at me. Officers shouted orders demanding that I step out and raise my hands. A young officer roughly slammed my face against the still-hot hood of the truck. Handcuffs tightened around my wrists. Sarah's father-in-law, Richard Harrington, stepped into the courtyard. He stood beside his wife. He adjusted the collar of his expensive plaid shirt and looked at me with the satisfaction of a predator. He told the police chief that I was a dangerous criminal. He wanted me to rot in prison for trespassing and destroying private property. They took me to the central police station. They shoved me into a cold interrogation room. I sat there for 3 hours. My hands remained cuffed behind my back. I didn't say a single word. I waited. The door swung open. My daughter's father-in-law entered with the corrupt police chief. He had no right to be there. But his money bought special treatment. He pulled out the chair across from me and sat down. Then he threw a stack of repair invoices onto the table. He laughed at me. He said I was nothing more than an old construction laborer. He said my worthless truck and my life were not worth a single corner of his gate. He threatened to take away my right to care for Sarah and have my daughter permanently committed to a psychiatric institution. I lifted my eyes and stared directly at his arrogant face. I didn't argue. My calmness caused his smile to freeze. In a low, cold voice, I said I didn't build houses for people like you. I built the police station you're sitting in right now. Richard's expression changed. He didn't understand what I meant. He thought I was rambling. The police chief suddenly received an urgent phone call. His face went pale. He looked at me with fear in his eyes. The interrogation room door was shoved open once again. A well-dressed man in a black suit walked inside. He was one of my people. The financial counterattack had officially begun. The man who walked in was Ben. He was my personal attorney. He set an expensive leather briefcase down on the rusted steel table. The police chief hurriedly removed my handcuffs. Richard Harrington sprang to his feet. He shouted, demanding to know who Ben was and why he had barged into the interrogation room. Ben didn't even look at Richard. He nodded respectfully to me and opened the briefcase. He pulled out a red faux leather binder. It was the red binder, the binder that held the fate of many arrogant people in this city. Richard glanced at it and let out a scornful laugh. He said that a construction worker and a cheap lawyer could never do anything to the Harrington family. He boasted that his Harrington Transportation Group was worth tens of millions of dollars. He was certain that his money would crush us. I stood up. I straightened the collar of my worn denim jacket. My dusty boots carried me closer to him. I stared directly into the eyes that were trying so hard to look superior. In a flat, emotionless voice, I gave Ben an order. Buy up all of their debt. I want to own the very air they breathe. Richard froze for a moment, then burst out laughing again. He thought I was joking, but his smile vanished instantly when Ben began reading the numbers. Ben explained that the Harrington Group was standing on the edge of bankruptcy. They were carrying $15 million in bad debt with the central bank. They had mortgaged every factory they owned, along with their estate. What Richard did not know was that every shell company buying those debts belonged to me. I had spent the last 30 years building a transportation empire under different names. I preferred a simple life with my old truck, but they had mistaken my humility for weakness, and they had hurt Sarah. Ben signed the final document and looked up at Richard. He announced that as of 5 minutes earlier I had become the largest creditor of the Harrington family. I owned all of their loans. I had the legal right to seize their assets whenever I chose. Richard's face changed from bright red to ghostly pale. He stammered without being able to form a sentence. His phone began vibrating non-stop. The calls were coming from shareholders and banks. He looked at me as if he were staring at a monster. I walked out of the interrogation room. I didn't bother looking back at the self-important man who was falling apart behind me. Ben walked beside me and quietly shared new information. Detective Mike had uncovered another shocking secret. The Harringtons' scheme against Sarah was never just about money. They were hiding something far worse. A crime so terrible that it could send their entire family to prison for the rest of their lives. I walked out of the police station. Dawn was breaking. The icy air filled my lungs. Detective Mike was already waiting beside my truck. He handed me a thick file. The tension on his face was impossible to miss. We got into the truck. Mike began reporting everything he had uncovered. It turned out that the glamorous Harrington family was nothing more than an empty shell. Their company had completely collapsed. Their useless son Tom Harrington had burned through $5 million on cryptocurrency. He had not only wiped out the family fortune, but had also become entangled in debts owed to organized crime. They were hunting him everywhere. The Harrington family was standing on the edge of disaster. My anger exploded when Mike turned to the next page. The documents showed that Sarah owned a piece of land worth $10 million. It had been inherited from her late grandmother. Richard and Margaret Harrington knew about it. They needed that land to save their family. So they devised a cruel plan. They bribed doctors. They injected Sarah with high doses of sedatives every day. They wanted to turn my daughter into someone legally incapable of managing her own affairs. Once that happened, they could gain control of her assets through perfectly legal channels. I gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that it creaked beneath my hands. My eyes stared into the distance. They had trampled on my daughter's trust. They had locked her inside a dark room. They had destroyed her mind for the sake of dirty money. They were no longer human. They were parasites. I closed the file. What they had done had crossed the final line for any father. I was not going to stop at taking back money. I was going to expose their corruption before the entire upper class. I was going to make them kneel in humiliation at the place they treasured most. Mike looked at me and asked what came next. I started the engine. The F-150 roared to life with a menacing growl. I told Mike to prepare for a major event. That night, the Harrington family was hosting a lavish charity gala. They planned to use the event to attract investors and hide the decay underneath their polished image. I was going to be there, and I was bringing them a surprise they would never forget. Before leaving, Mike added one more piece of information. The empty syringe I had found in the bathroom did not contain an ordinary sedative. It contained a powerful illegal substance that had been smuggled from an unknown source. And the Harrington family was hiding another horrifying secret. The drug was connected to a deadly accident on Route 9. Whatever happened on that road was so dangerous, so damaging that they were willing to push Sarah toward destruction to keep it buried. For the first time that night, even Mike seemed uneasy. And that told me one thing. The truth, waiting at the end of this road, was far darker than any of us had imagined. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the grand ballroom of the five-star hotel. The city's elite mingled in expensive designer outfits. Richard and Margaret Harrington stood at the center of it all. They laughed and smiled like royalty. This spectacle of luxury was nothing more than a mask covering the rot beneath. The ballroom doors opened. I walked in. I was dressed in a custom-tailored black tuxedo. There was no old pickup truck, no dust-covered work boots. My calm, commanding presence caused heads to turn throughout the room. Margaret spotted me. The wine glass in her hand trembled slightly. Fear flashed across her face before her arrogance quickly returned. She walked over and leaned close to whisper in my ear. She told me this was a place for people with money. She threatened to call security and have a ragged truck driver like me thrown out. At that very moment, a young waitress accidentally spilled a few drops of water onto Margaret's dress. Margaret exploded with rage. She slapped the young woman across the face and called her a filthy, worthless poor girl. The waitress burst into tears and repeatedly apologized. The cruelty of the Harrington family had not changed one bit. I stepped forward. I helped the waitress back to her feet. I looked directly into Margaret's eyes. I didn't argue. I acted. The charity auction began. The most valuable item was the Harrington family sapphire, an heirloom passed down through generations. They were auctioning it off to raise money for their hidden debts. Richard announced the opening bid, $100,000. The room fell silent. Nobody wanted to invest money in a family surrounded by bankruptcy rumors. I raised my hand. 200,000. Richard's eyes widened. Margaret froze. Another wealthy guest deliberately pushed the price to $300,000. I never blinked. 400,000. A wave of astonishment swept through the ballroom. The auctioneer's hammer came down. The sapphire belonged to me. I walked onto the stage and accepted the velvet box containing the gemstone. Then, I turned away from the podium. I walked directly to the waitress who had been slapped. Gently, I placed the $400,000 sapphire into her trembling hands. Then I spoke loudly enough for the entire ballroom to hear. This gift is compensation for the humiliation inflicted by people who mistake wealth for class. Margaret's face drained of color. Richard stood frozen before the city's elite. Their pride had been crushed beneath my feet. For the first time that evening, they looked truly powerless. Whispers spread across the ballroom like wildfire. I turned and walked away. My phone vibrated. A message from Detective Mike appeared on the screen. Sarah was no longer at the city hospital. The Harrington family had secretly transferred her to St. Jude's, a private psychiatric facility. Isolated. Notorious. My blood ran cold. They were trying to make Sarah disappear before the truth about the Route 9 accident came to light. I stared at the message for several seconds. Then another notification arrived. It contained a photograph. The image showed Sarah being wheeled through a secured corridor only an hour earlier. Her eyes were half open. Her wrists were restrained, and standing beside her was a man I recognized immediately. Tom Harrington, the same man who was supposedly drowning in debt and hiding from dangerous creditors, which meant Tom was not running away. He was protecting something, or someone, and whatever secret was buried behind the Route 9 accident was important enough for the Harrington family to risk everything, including my daughter's life, to keep it hidden. I drove through the empty night. My destination was St. Jude's, a secluded psychiatric hospital hidden deep within a pine forest. The facility was surrounded by towering concrete walls and coils of barbed wire. The Harrington family believed they could use money to hide my daughter in a dark corner of the world. They were wrong. I didn't bring guns. I didn't bring hired muscle. I brought something far more powerful. The law. And the cold force of financial influence. Behind me were 4 vehicles carrying state fire inspectors and health department investigators. Through the connections recorded in the red binder, I had triggered an unannounced inspection. The iron gates of St. Jude's opened under government authority. Dr. Evans emerged with panic written across his face. He tried to stop us with procedural excuses. He claimed the facility strictly protected patient confidentiality. He insisted that Sarah was receiving special treatment and that no visitors were allowed. I took a step forward. My leather boots struck the floor with a sharp echo. I stared directly into the eyes behind his glasses. In a low, controlled voice, I said, "This facility is being investigated today. I'm here to take my daughter home." The inspectors went to work. Within minutes, they uncovered a long list of serious safety and licensing violations. Dr. Evans was helpless. He knew his career would be finished if he continued obstructing the investigation. His hands trembled as he handed me the key to the isolation room. I opened the door to room 304. The room was dark. The smell of bleach hung heavily in the air. Sarah was loosely chained to the side of the bed. She had become painfully thin. Her head hung forward. When she saw my silhouette, she flinched in fear. I walked to her bedside and knelt beside her. Carefully, I removed the chain from her wrist. Then I lifted her into my arms. She felt as light as a dried leaf. The cold fury inside me hardened into a vow. Everyone involved in this would pay. I carried Sarah down the hospital corridor. Dr. Evans and the security guards could do nothing but watch. Camera flashes from the investigators lit up the hallway as they documented the scene. I placed Sarah gently into the back seat of my F-150 and covered her with a warm blanket. Then we left St. Jude's behind. As the truck rolled down the highway, Sarah slowly opened her eyes. The sedatives were beginning to wear off. Her mind seemed clearer. She grabbed the sleeve of my jacket. Her body trembled. Then she spoke. Tears streamed down her face. She revealed a horrifying secret. Tom Harrington had not merely caused a fatal accident on Route 9. According to Sarah, the victim's body had not been moved by the Harrington family afterward. Tom himself had done it, and he had not acted alone. Sarah said she watched as Tom and another person moved the victim, while the man was still barely alive and struggling to breathe. The memory shattered her. She buried her face against my chest and sobbed uncontrollably. I pulled the truck onto the shoulder of the road. My hands tightened around the steering wheel. There was one more question, one final piece of the nightmare that remained hidden. I gently asked Sarah who had been there with Tom that night. Her lips trembled. For several seconds she could not speak. Then she finally whispered a name so unexpected that the blood drained from my face. It was not a criminal. It was not a stranger. It was someone the entire city trusted. Someone whose reputation was built on honor, charity, and public service. And if Sarah was telling the truth, that person had helped bury a living man on Route 9. If you've made it this far, then this story has probably stirred some emotions in you. Please do us a small favor that only takes a moment. Like and subscribe. Leave a comment with the number 5 so I know you've watched all the way to this point, and tell me how you think the story will end to see if your prediction is correct. A lot of people watch without doing that, but it costs you nothing and means a great deal to us. The F-150 sped through the darkness. I watched my daughter through the rearview mirror. Sarah was curled up on the back seat. Her lips were bruised and trembling uncontrollably. I pulled onto a deserted dirt road beneath a bridge. I switched off the headlights. The world fell into a frightening silence. I turned around and took her ice-cold hand in mine. I told Sarah that everything was safe now. She didn't have to be afraid anymore. Sarah began to cry. Tears of pain and fear soaked into the blanket covering her. Then she told me what had happened on Route 9. It had occurred 6 months earlier during a violent rainstorm. Tom Harrington was drunk after losing a massive gambling bet. He drove at a reckless speed. Then he struck a man crossing the road. The impact was devastating. The victim was thrown nearly 10 meters. Tom panicked. He intended to flee, but his vehicle broke down. So he called his father, Richard. Only 15 minutes later, Richard arrived. He wasn't alone. A man wearing a police uniform stepped out beside him. It was the city's corrupt police chief. The victim was still alive. Barely. The man lifted a hand and tried to beg for help. But Richard coldly ordered Tom and the police chief to drag the victim into a remote ravine and erase the scene. Sarah witnessed everything from inside the vehicle. She screamed and tried to run out to help the injured man. Tom held her back. Richard then approached the car door. His eyes looked like those of a venomous snake. He forced Sarah to sign a false confession, admitting responsibility for the death. He threatened her. If she refused, he would make me disappear forever. Sarah endured it all to protect my life. But even that was not enough for them. They feared that one day she would tell the truth. That was why they began poisoning her with powerful sedatives. The cold rage inside my chest transformed into something darker. They wanted my daughter to carry a murder charge for their corrupt bloodline. That was the greatest mistake they would ever make. The Harrington family was not merely greedy. They were killers. They treated the lives of ordinary people as if they were worthless. I pulled Sarah into my arms. I said nothing. My silence had become a sentence. Not for my daughter. For the Harrington Empire. I was no longer willing to leave this in the hands of local corrupt officers. I would expose everything myself. I started the truck and called Detective Mike. I instructed him to send every piece of evidence to the federal prosecutor's office. But before he could answer, a loud noise erupted behind us. 3 black vehicles without headlights blocked the only exit from the dirt road. The corrupt police chief stepped out. 2 deputies followed him. Each man carried a bag filled with white powder. They were walking toward my truck with victorious smiles, and I immediately understood their plan. They weren't coming to arrest me. They were coming to manufacture evidence. They intended to frame me, and if they succeeded, Sarah and I would never get the chance to tell the truth. The corrupt police chief walked toward me. He tapped the butt of his pistol against my truck window. He ordered me to step out. His 2 deputies quickly opened the rear door and tossed 2 bags of white powder into the vehicle. They grinned triumphantly. The chief announced that I was under arrest for possession of a large quantity of illegal narcotics. He said that this time I would rot in prison forever. I didn't panic. I didn't flinch. My calmness erased the smile from his face. I stepped out of the truck at an unhurried pace. Both hands slipped into the pockets of my denim jacket. Then I looked up toward a small smoke detector mounted beneath the roof of my truck. A cold smile crossed my face. In a low voice, just loud enough for him to hear, I said, "Smile, Chief. You're being live-streamed in 4K to the cloud." He froze. His eyes followed mine. Behind the shell of the smoke detector was a miniature high-definition hidden camera. It had been installed by Detective Mike. Every second of the drug-planting scheme, every smug word spoken by the chief had been transmitted live online and forwarded directly to federal prosecutors. His phone immediately began ringing non-stop. He answered. The confidence drained from his face. Then came fear. Then complete devastation. The voice on the other end shattered him. An order suspending him from duty had been issued. So had an arrest warrant. Corruption. Murder. Obstruction of justice. Millions of people across the state were already watching the live stream. Public outrage exploded like wildfire. The 2 deputies dropped their weapons. They knew the game was over. The police chief collapsed to his knees in the muddy road. He looked at me with desperate eyes. Begging. Pleading. I didn't even glance at him. I climbed back into the truck and drove past him. The corruption of the Harrington family and everyone protecting them had finally been dragged into the light. The F-150 thundered down the highway toward the city. The Harrington Empire was collapsing in a domino effect. Their bank accounts were frozen. Federal agents were surrounding their estate. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. My phone suddenly rang. An unfamiliar sound came through the speaker. A child's terrified scream. My grandson Toby. Then came the frantic, unhinged voice of Tom Harrington. He had escaped the federal dragnet. He had kidnapped Toby and taken him to the family's abandoned steel mill. Tom demanded $10 million and a helicopter to flee the country. If his demands were not met within 30 minutes, he swore he would burn my grandson alive. My grip tightened around the steering wheel. The leather creaked beneath my fingers. Sarah sat upright in the back seat, her face turning pale as she heard Tom's threats. For a moment nobody spoke. Only the roar of the engine filled the cab. Then Tom laughed. The sound was broken, desperate. The laugh of a man who knew his world was ending. He gave the location. Then he hung up. Silence returned. I stared through the windshield at the endless stretch of highway ahead. Everything had led to this moment. The lies, The corruption, the drugs, the murder on Route 9, the destruction of my daughter. Now my grandson's life hung in the balance. A father can endure a great deal. A grandfather can endure even less. I pressed the accelerator to the floor. The truck surged forward. Behind me, the Harrington Empire was collapsing. Ahead of me waited the abandoned steel mill. And somewhere inside that rusted maze of steel and fire, Tom Harrington was about to discover that there was one thing more dangerous than a desperate criminal, a man fighting for his family. The F-150 tore through the night like an arrow. My destination was the abandoned Harrington steel mill. The place was filled with rusting steel structures and silent blast furnaces that had long gone cold. My worthless son-in-law, Tom Harrington, was inside. And he had my grandson, Toby. I wasn't going alone. I picked up my radio and switched to the common frequency used by truck drivers across the city. I spoke only one sentence. My son-in-law kidnapped my grandson at the old steel mill. I need help. The response was immediate. The strength of a community built by hard-working men and women erupted into action. Within 10 minutes, hundreds of 18-wheelers came rumbling in from every direction. Their headlights flooded the entire factory complex with brilliant light. Air horns thundered across the night. Every entrance and exit was sealed. Tom Harrington was trapped inside a ring of steel and light. I entered the mill alone. My leather boots struck concrete, littered with broken glass. The echoes were cold and hollow. Tom stood on an elevated steel platform. A pistol was pressed against Toby's head. My grandson was screaming in terror. Tom looked insane. He could smell the end closing in around him. He demanded $10 million in cash. He demanded a helicopter immediately. He swore he would pull the trigger if I took another step. I stopped. I looked directly at the barrel of the gun. The calmer I remained, the more terrified he became. In a voice as cold as ice, I said, "You've already lost everything, Tom. Your fortune is gone. Your parents are under arrest. There's nowhere left for you to run." Tom screamed curses at me. His hands tightened around the weapon. Then came the moment when panic overwhelmed reason. He started pulling the trigger toward Toby. I moved. A father's instinct, a grandfather's instinct. It drove me forward with impossible speed. I threw myself between the gun and my grandson. The gunshot exploded through the factory. The sound split the darkness in two. The bullet slammed into my left shoulder. Hot blood poured through my worn denim jacket. I didn't cry out. I didn't fall. The pain meant nothing. My remaining arm wrapped tightly around Toby. At that exact moment, Ben's elite private security team stormed through the upper windows. They moved with flawless precision. Within seconds, Tom was disarmed and pinned to the steel floor. His pistol clattered away with a metallic ring. Handcuffs snapped around his wrists. Tom screamed helplessly as they dragged him down. I dropped to one knee on the factory floor. Blood continued dripping onto the rusted steel beneath me. But Toby was safe. That was all that mattered. I watched them haul my son-in-law away. The brutal war had finally reached its final chapters. Then, as Tom was dragged past me, he laughed. Not loudly, not wildly, just a quiet, vicious laugh. He leaned closer and whispered into my ear. Richard had escaped. Before federal agents closed in, he had managed to move a suitcase containing the family's final cache of gold and every piece of their secret documentation. According to Tom, the suitcase was already aboard a private jet preparing to leave for a country without extradition treaties. The Harrington family was not completely destroyed. Not yet. If Richard escaped, part of his empire would survive. I watched Tom being dragged into the darkness. Then my phone vibrated. A message from Ben. Only 3 words. "We found him." Attached was a photograph. Richard Harrington was standing alone on the tarmac of a private airfield. A black suitcase was handcuffed to his wrist. The engines of a sleek private jet were already running behind him. The timestamp on the image showed it had been taken less than 3 minutes earlier. I stared at the screen. Blood ran down my arm. Toby clung to my side. And for the first time that night I smiled. Richard Harrington thought he was about to escape. But he didn't realize something important. The plane was already surrounded. And the person waiting for him on that runway was not a federal agent. It was Sarah. Federal police sirens echoed across the private airport runway. The Harrington family jet was stopped moments before takeoff. Richard and Margaret Harrington were escorted off the aircraft in cold steel handcuffs. The suitcase containing the secret documents and the family's final cache of gold was seized. They screamed. They blamed each other. They desperately tried to negotiate lighter sentences. The arrogance they once wore so proudly had turned into complete humiliation. They would spend the rest of their lives facing the consequences of their crimes. 6 months later, the storm had passed. The wound in my left shoulder had healed into a scar. But the lessons remained. Sarah now sat proudly in the executive office of the new Vance Transportation Group. My daughter had regained her confidence. Her smile had returned. The grand Harrington mansion had been purchased and renovated. The corruption and vanity that once filled its halls were gone. In their place stood a safe haven for abused women and children. Toby's laughter echoed through the courtyard where the iron gate had once crashed to the ground. I stood by a window watching a line of 18-wheelers roll down the highway. The life of an old truck driver continued in its simple way. True power is not found in expensive suits or luxurious mansions. It is found in love. It is found in the determination to protect your family. Never underestimate a quiet father. Real power does not come from your address. It comes from the people willing to stand beside you when everything is on the line. Live an honest life. But never allow anyone to trample on the people you love. Justice may arrive late, but when it comes, it settles every account fairly. Thank you for joining Dad's Real-Life Revenge. Don't forget to share your own story in the comments, and hit like and subscribe so you won't miss the next hard-earned lesson. See you in the next video.